Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's coffee talk from Planet Fair. I'm Henrike von Platen, and I'm talking with my friend
Margrét Bjarnadóttir.
So great. I love this beginning. It's just perfect.
Yes, and happy German Diversity Day.
Oh, yes, that was just a couple of sort of days ago. I don't remember exactly, maybe a week ago. It's just around the corner. That was interesting. It was a nice one. It was interesting to sort of live it from, like say, virtual. It was a virtual diversity day.
Yep. But you were giving a keynote, right?
Yeah, I had a little speech in a company that made like a diversity week, and on one day and it was exactly on the diversity day, I had a talk. I had like 20 minutes power talk.
Okay, awesome. And I also know, maybe because you told me before we hit record, that you were talking about stereotypes. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about what you were talking about.
Well, I do like the stereotype part because you see, if you think about pay equity, and I'm like always talking like pay first, and then diversity will drop into place if your system is objective and stereotype free, meaning that all the things that we see that happen with diverse people treating each other differently because of the stereotypes they have lead to these differences in the system, treating people unequally in an unfair way. Unequal is okay if it's fair, but being treated unequally on an unfair basis most of the time, in my view, happens due to the stereotypes that we have. We take one person that we sort of see as a similar one, we treat it well because we have a good feeling, because similar to us means it's near us, it's the same to us. And if we see somebody different, the differences is something people tend to be not exactly afraid of, but sort of more cautious or whatever, and they start treating them differently because they don't feel they are part of their own family, community, and so on. And that's sort of the internal stereotypes that we have, that when we were still hunting, I don't know, whatever, years ago, that might have been quite useful, but nowadays it leads to unfairness. So what I sort of try to get to the point through is, if you start with your pay equity and you start to really set up a fair pay system based on gender as a KPI that you can calculate, you will sort of get rid of your stereotypes and have a fair system. Yeah, and the other part I always like to say is stop training women negotiating skills, start training the people that actually are in charge of the hiring process in your company to hire bias-free. Bias-free meaning then getting rid of their stereotypes, or at least not trapping into them. I mean, you cannot get rid of them. They might sometimes even be useful, but get rid of them when you're hiring somebody. So yeah, that was what I talked about in part. And actually, always when I talk about that, I have to think of you, Margrét, because then I think I do truly believe that this is the case. But does data reflect that? Have you actually seen stereotypes somehow reflected when you have been looking at so much company data based on gender KPI, but looking at everything?
Yeah. So let me first circle back to something that you said that stuck with me, and then I will answer your question. But because you said, let's stop training the women's negotiating skill and start training the hiring committee. And as a university professor, I sometimes sit on hiring committees. And there we have to take bias training even before we get charged with hiring someone. So I so agree with that. And another thing, if any of our listeners have not taken these unconscious bias tests, it's always eye-opening. And I think, because as you know, and that this is a perfect segue into my answer to your question about what do we see in the data, we all know that we have our unconscious biases, right, towards whether it's, female versus male, or white versus black, or old versus young, or, pick your category, right? So you can take these tests that aim to measure these things. And I think the results that someone within my circle of people that work on pay equity day in and day out, they describe their own results as disappointing. right? So even us that are, talking about pay equity day in and day out, working on changing pay equity throughout the world, we still have our unconscious biases, right? So, so maybe we can link to that in our description of this week's episode, where we can, people can go and just take a look at what these tests tell us, and then we can debate their accuracy. But it's always eye-opening. Anywho, you were asking about what does the data tell us, and it's interesting to me that at least the way I think about how stereotypes and unconscious biases, how it kind of gets into or is highlighted by pay equity analysis is basically through blind spots, right? Because we all are trying to do our best, right? So we're all trying to create fair structures. We are all trying to do the right thing. But my favorite story is about an organization that was all in on pay equity, right? But when we analyzed their pay structures, what we found was that the top performing female employees were not being compensated to the same extent for their fabulous performance as similar male employees. So while their salaries were, yes, above average, they weren't being paid to the top like the top performing male employees, right? And for that organization, that was really an aha moment. And I link that back to stereotypes, because when you think about your top performer, what is your stereotype like? And then the salary kind of follows that. And I see this, this is why I always smile when I start talking about performance data, because it's so interesting, right? Because in pay equity is one of these things and one of the ways where we can see interesting behavioral patterns emerge. And another thing that I see over and over again is that women are penalized more for poor performance compared to poor performing men. So again, kind of these stereotypes and unconscious biases creeping into how we react to performance data. So I always think this is interesting.
Absolutely, I do so too, and it's the funny thing always is, or not funny actually, it's actually a bit sad also when you think about bias trainings. Some people actually believe that when they've done one, they are healed. You're usually never healed from a bias training unless you have one where you actually experience bias. That's a very different version. There are very few of those. And normally you know what your biases are about, so that you can start training yourself to act differently, but you're not healed. And years ago, there were even studies that when people had done the bias trainings, it got worse in a way, because they thought they were healed and they just went on the same as before. So it's also like, watch out which one you do, so you are actually at least getting better afterwards, but you will never be healed from unconscious bias. Yep.
Yeah. And that brings us to 8 minutes. I know. Perfect, on the money.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Thank you so much, Margrét. It was fun again. I'm looking forward to next time. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.